Hi there, and welcome to Steps Together, the Steps for Development podcast, where we come together to learn and build our own skills so that we can help the children in our lives to thrive and succeed. I'm your host, Deb Johnson, and I'm so glad you're here. No matter what role you have in a child's life, you're in the right place to learn about child development and kids who are differently wired. Here, you'll learn about the why behind behaviors, practical strategies that make a difference, and how to advocate and support all children as you become empowered with tools and skills that bring lasting change. In today's episode, I want to talk about all things sensory. Sensory kids, sensory diets, sensory processing disorder, sensory differences. These are hot topics in occupational therapy. As an occupational therapist who is certified in sensory integration, assessment, and treatment, it is a passion of mine to talk about our nervous system, our brain, how we take in sensory information and process it in order to create what we call the adaptive responses that let us participate and enjoy life. The thing about sensory processing is that there are so many misconceptions out there, and that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about 6 misconceptions or myths about sensory processing that I often have to address with parents in an evaluation session or during the course of therapy. So let's dive right in with the first issue. That is that sensory processing is a medical diagnosis. Wrong. That's a myth. Sensory processing disorder is not a medical diagnosis. It's a set of theoretical constructs that were created by an occupational therapist named Jean Ayres back in the early 70s. She wrote a book about learning disorders and what she noticed in the children who she was seeing who had learning disorders, but they also had co-occurring problems with motor coordination and some other motor skill issues. So she hypothesized that there was something going on in the brain correlated with the learning disorder that made it difficult for these children in terms of coordinating their body. Now, across many disciplines, neurology and psychology and psychiatry and just medicine in general, as well as occupational, physical, and speech therapy, we all acknowledge the process of sensory integration as a neurological process that occurs in our brain, in our nervous system. Sensory integration is this physiological process of our body taking in sensory input and then allowing our body to respond to that sensory input. Some of the parts of the brain that are very involved in this process include the limbic system. It includes this arousal, right? This fight or flight response, as well as the pleasure centers. What types of sensory input are calming and organizing and bring us relief or pleasure, if you will. So it's important to know that sensory differences, things like hypo or hypersensitivity to sound or touch, are often correlated with other medical diagnoses. So for example, in the criteria for diagnosing autism disorders, there is one criteria that lists hyper or hyposensitivity to sensory input. That doesn't mean that all children on the spectrum have sensory differences, but we do see it a large portion of the time. I mean, I would say anecdotally for myself, I see individuals on the spectrum having some sort of sensory sensitivities, sensory overwhelm, difficulty recognizing or processing sensory input, being under responsive, I would say that we see that probably 90% of the time. But even within individuals on the autism spectrum, you're going to see varying levels of that sensitivity or under responsiveness, just like you'll see in the typical population, that the sensory differences occur on a continuum. So, for example, I might be much more sensitive and over responsive to sound than you are. Or maybe you are much more responsive to tactile input, like how your clothes feel, and I'm not bothered at all by that kind of input. Maybe you crave movement and you love going on roller coasters. I don't. I don't crave it. And honestly, sometimes it makes me feel sick. So there's more hypersensitivity to the movement. So it's important to notice and recognize that we all have those differences. And understanding those sensory differences can really help us to be more respectful and appreciative of another person's perspective. We typically call it a sensory processing disorder when an individual is displaying problems with processing sensory input and responding to it in a way that is chronic and pervasive, impacting daily functioning, daily life, daily skills. And we will see the impact on motor skills, gross motor, fine motor, visual motor. We will see the problems with social interactions. We'll see the problems in play and in self-care, and really so many different areas of development that can be impacted when the problems with sensory processing are chronic and pervasive, and to a degree that we would theoretically call it a disorder. So another myth about sensory processing disorder is that sensory diets fix sensory problems, sensory differences or disorders. So many times I have a parent come into OT asking for a sensory diet. And sometimes the doctor will even have referred them to OT and told the parent, take your child to OT and ask for a sensory diet, as if that's going to make everything all better. That's not true. So first, let's start with what is a sensory diet. A sensory diet is a term that was coined by an occupational therapist in the 1980s. And the idea behind a sensory diet was that our sensory systems, our nervous system requires sensory input just the same way our whole body requires nutrition. That's why they chose the word diet, to try to make that analogy. And the idea wasn't that you would get a list of activities to do and you did them at prescribed times, like at 10 o'clock and noon and 2 o'clock and 6 o'clock, you did specific activities. That's what they called thinking like making it like a recipe. And sensory diets are not intended to be a recipe. They're intended to be like a menu. So, for example, you have sensory snacks and you have sensory meals, the same way you might want a big breakfast or a light breakfast, or you might just want a tiny little snack, or you want to sit down to a 5-course meal. The same way that your body wants that kind of variation in your food and in your nutrition, our nervous system needs that kind of variation when it comes to our sensory input. So, for example, in the morning, you might need more intense sensory input to wake up, but at night, you need very calm and quiet sensory input, less intensity, so that you can bring yourself down to fall asleep. The key is that you are needing those sensory experiences throughout the course of the day in order to maintain a level of arousal or alertness so that you can function through the day. So let's say, for example, late in the day, you're feeling a little groggy, you're going to choose to do something to either alert yourself, right, and wake up, or you're going to go take a nap because you're tired and you need to rest. So if you're not able to go take a nap or you don't want to rest, you might get something cold to drink, or you might go outside for a walk, or you might put on some fast music, something that's going to something that's going to tap into your nervous system and regulate your responses, and it will alert you. It will increase your arousal level. So a sensory diet was intended to be this proactive way of maintaining our optimum level of alertness throughout the day. The problem is we often use these activities reactively instead of proactively, and we think of them as prescriptive, so that we have to do certain activities at 10 o'clock every morning. Well, the problem is our nervous system doesn't work like that. It's very dynamic and it changes every day. So if your child didn't sleep very well last night, then the following day, they might need very different types of sensory activities than what you usually give them when they have a good night's sleep. So you have to be able to be responsive. It's much better to think about a sensory life or a sensory lifestyle instead of a diet, which sounds more prescriptive and more routine and, the same for everybody, right? Like you might have a low-fat diet, there's that just doesn't exist when it comes to sensory activities. So I want you to think about it, how you yourself as an adult engage in a variety of sensory activities over the course of the day, depending on your state of alertness, or what we say is a state of arousal. So if you're feeling groggy, you have a set of things that you do in order to alert yourself and help yourself to keep going. If you're feeling a little agitated or anxious, you probably have things that you do that are calming and organizing. That's a sensory life. And when we can get that kind of an individualized, dynamic, adaptable, flexible kind of a system, program, activity list for your child, you are going to find that your child responds much more appropriately and much more effectively, that it's just a more effective tool. And it's really important that we understand our children. We understand how this child responds, and we understand what our sensory differences are, and that working to meet sensory preferences and accommodate sensory needs is far more important than some sort of prescriptive list of activities. So being able to problem solve and be a good detective is really important. Myth number 3, children grow out of sensory problems. Adults do not have sensory issues. Wrong. Nothing could be further from the truth. Many adults have sensory processing problems. Many have sensory processing disorder. We all have sensory preferences. We have sensory input that we are averse to, things that we don't like. And kids who display sensory processing disorder or differences, they're not going to grow out of it. What does happen, though, is that as we grow, our nervous system changes. So as our children grow, their nervous system maybe develops a little bit less sensitivity to sound, or they have developed appropriate coping strategies. So one of my children, very sensitive to sound and touch as a child, now as a young adult, they are much more able to modulate those responses, and their nervous system has calmed down a bit and quieted. However, they are still sensitive to sound and still sensitive to touch. So it didn't go away, it just got tempered a little bit. Our nervous system also changes to as we get older. So, as when I was young, I had a lot of sensitivity to movement. I was very prone to motion sickness, never enjoyed roller coasters or that type of thing. And like I said, always sick in the car. I couldn't be a passenger. I needed to be the driver as a young adult and through most of my adulthood. What I'm finding now that I am more older and wiser, and my nervous system has aged a little bit. What I'm finding is that my vestibular system is actually not as responsive. And now, if I'm a passenger in a car, I can actually like scroll on my phone or read a little bit out of a book, and it doesn't make my stomach upset or anything like that. So that's just an example of how the nervous system matures and changes as we grow. So again, it's not that we grow out of it, it's just that our body changes and we learn new skills. All right, myth number 4, sensory sensitivity is always to sound or touch. Wrong. There are so many more differences. So we have not just 5 sensory systems, we have 8 sensory systems. We have the 5 that we always think about, and then we have 3 that we refer to as hidden senses. So these include our vestibular system. That's how we process movement, and it tells us where we are in terms of gravity and the pull of the earth, right? It processes that those senses. Then we have something called proprioception. These are the receptors in our muscles, bones, and joints. And these receptors tell us where our body is in space. It's what allows you to close your eyes and know where your feet are. Are they on the ground or are they over your head? Are you upside down? Is your hand in front of you or behind your back? You can tell because your brain processes those senses, those signals coming from the muscles, bones, and joints in your hands. And then the final sense that we all have is what's called interoception. Interoception is the sense of our internal organs. So these are the sensory receptors that tell us that our bladder is full, that our stomach is empty, that our heart is racing, that we are breathing shallowly or deeply. It's all those internal feelings. And with all of these 8 sensory systems, you can have a variety of responsiveness. You can be hyper sensitive to sound and hypo sensitive to touch. So you're over responsive to sound, but under responsive to touch. You could have a hypersensitive interoceptive system, but an under responsive sense of body awareness, which is proprioception. When we do what's called the computational math, we have to figure out how many different combinations can we have. We consider 6 subtypes of sensory processing disorder. And this is probably complicated enough that I should devote a whole episode just to the 6 subtypes. But I'm just going to tell you there are 3 types of what we call modulation disorders. There are 2 types of motor disorders, and there is sensory discrimination disorder. So they all are described differently in terms of the way we respond, the way our body perceives and understands sensory input, but most importantly, how it is that we respond to the sensory input. So 6 subtypes of sensory processing disorder, 8 sensory systems. When we do the computational math to figure out how many different combinations there could be, that number is just under 3 million different combinations. So this tells you why no 2 people are the same. We are all so very different. Now we see patterns of sensory profiles, if you will. We very often see individuals who have, for example, high sensitivity to sound and touch. We often see that paired with giftedness or Fragile X or autism, so certain things that co-occur together. We often see children who are under-responsive to proprioception or vestibular input. Those children also have motor problems where they're uncoordinated and poor balance. They don't know where their body is in space. We see children who have low muscle tone and postural problems, one type of sensory processing disorder, and they very often have under-responsivity to certain types of input. So we might see patterns and some commonalities across sensory profiles. But when it comes right down to it, no two people are exactly the same. And that is just another reason why it's so very important to consider sensory processing as one more way for us to better understand each other, for us to be able to respect and just have empathy for the fact that we're all very, very different. All right, myth number 5. Sensory seeking is ADHD. No. ADHD is its own medical diagnosis. There's clear criteria for defining ADHD. Sensory seeking is an informal term that refers to people who need to move. It refers to the hyperactivity. In theoretical terms, as an occupational therapist, sensory seeking doesn't really exist. We all know, we all have thresholds of response. So we know that we all have different thresholds. And some people have a very high threshold, say for movement, and they want lots and lots of movement until they've met that threshold and they feel good. Some people have very, very low thresholds for that movement. But the individual that has a high threshold for movement, that doesn't mean they have ADHD just because they are physically very active. And there are many individuals who have what's called inattentive ADHD, and there is no hyperactivity. There is no increase in movement. So some of the research in our field suggests that individuals diagnosed with ADHD have co-occurring sensory issues 40 to 60% of the time. So that's a pretty big range. But if 40 to 60% of people with ADHD also have sensory issues or sensory processing disorder, that means that 40 to 60% don't. So please don't correlate sensory seeking as a sensory processing disorder, and don't conflate or confuse that a hyperactive person necessarily has ADHD. The two just don't go together. There may be times they are correlated, that they do go together, but there's not this blanket assumption that ADHD means sensory seeking or sensory disordered in terms of craving more movement. So the key difference between these two conditions is that sensory behaviors are about regulating our responses to sensory input, where ADHD is defined as problems with attention and executive function skills. So they are, in fact, two very different kinds of conditions. There's a lot of blurred lines there. There's a lot of confusion and a lot of different theories. It can be very, very difficult to tease out what is a sensory issue and what is the ADHD issue. But again, I just want you to be aware that while many individuals and many children have both ADHD and SPD, one does not equal the other. They are two separate things. All right, our last myth for today. Kids with SPD can control their responses when they want to. They have that ability to turn it off whenever they want. No, 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 100 times no. So sensory processing disorder and the behaviors that come with it, those are what we call bottom-up responses. They're very brain-based. They just come out of the primitive areas of our limbic system, our nervous system, brain. We're not thinking about these. So think about yourself if you are sensitive to like nails on a chalkboard, or maybe being in a crowded space if you feel a little claustrophobic. You can do what's called top-down control over those responses. So if you're going into a crowded space, for example, and you normally get claustrophobic, but you really want to be in that space because it's maybe somebody you really want to hear talk, or you're going to a concert or whatever, then you could do that top-down inhibition to control your responses. One time I did a workshop, and one of the therapists that was attending, when I talked about this, she raised her hand and said, I hate the smell of coffee. I am always bothered by the smell of coffee, but I have been married for 30 years to a man who loves coffee. And she said, every morning I suck it up and make his coffee because I love him. And even though the smell of the coffee bothers me, I push through it, and it doesn't bother me as much now after all these years. I still don't like coffee. I don't want to drink it. I don't really like the smell of it. And I do it because I love him. That is a really great example of top-down inhibition, top-down convincing herself that she needed to make this coffee for her husband. And can we do that as adults? Absolutely. Can children do it? No, at least not very effectively, unless they are really, really motivated or driven. So for example, they really, really want to do gymnastics. And so they push through wearing the leotard and tights, even though the tight clothing bothers them like crazy. Some children have the top-down capacity to do that. Many don't. And I personally have worked with children who could not participate in an activity they wanted to do because they couldn't tolerate the clothing. There was just no way. I've had children who couldn't do gymnastics or couldn't do martial arts because they couldn't wear the belt. They couldn't, I had a little girl I worked with who couldn't ride horses at her grandma's because she couldn't handle putting on the boots that her grandmother required for their safety when they were riding. And it brought these children to tears that they couldn't do what they wanted to do. So no, they can't just automatically turn it off, but they can certainly at times inhibit their responses when they are so intrinsically motivated to participate. The other piece that is confusing when we talk about controlling emotions is what I call the paradox of sensory processing disorder. When you have a child who yells at you because you are loud, and then 5 minutes later, they are screaming at the top of their lungs. Well, let me tell you why that happens. It has everything to do with control and expectations. So sensory input is completely different, whether it is controlled by you, you know it's coming, it's expected, it's anticipated, you're prepared for it. You're the one that's even creating the sensory input, like being loud, screaming. That doesn't bother you at all. It bothers you when it is unexpected and they didn't know it was coming, like a light touch on the shoulder or a sound that came from behind. So it's the unexpected component that often sets a child off into that fight or flight response. And that's why it can seem paradoxical at times, just really counterintuitive that in one moment they're upset about the touch, right? The light touch. And then the next minute they're just in the mud getting completely dirty. And you're like, I don't get it. It has everything to do with control, everything to do with being ready for it, everything to do with knowing that it's coming so that I can prepare. Some children, again, will do that top down as well because they really want to participate in that activity. Maybe they don't want to get embarrassed in a social situation, so they're not going to let themselves act that way. I do want to caution you that if your child does a lot of top down strategies, if your child is inhibiting their responses to sensory input and pushing down that fight or flight response because they want to present a certain way, or they don't want to break the rules, or, like I say, they're worried about being embarrassed or whatever, those are the kids who hold it together all day long and then come home and vomit on their family. They just spew, they just lose it when they get home. So these are the kids that make it through school all day long because they're pushing it down, they're masking, they're hiding all those vulnerabilities. And that's a lot of work and a lot of effort. And they get home and it's blah, they just let it go. And we as parents at home get the brunt of it. We'll have to talk about that on another episode because there are certainly things that you can do to help with that kind of transition when they come home. All right, so what is important to take away from today's episode? I really want you to understand some of the realities of sensory processing disorder. I want you to know that it's not a medical diagnosis. A sensory diet isn't going to fix it. Kids are not going to grow out of it. Sensory sensitivity goes across 8 different sensory systems, and there are 6 subtypes of sensory processing disorder. So there are just many, many different combinations. No 2 people look alike, and it's got way more to do with sensory processing of all kinds of input, not just touch and sound. Sensory seeking or other kinds of sensory processing disorders, these are not the same as ADHD or autism or other diagnoses. And it absolutely takes a ton of effort to do top-down inhibition to control your responses to sensory input, because your nervous system is driven to function from bottom up. We get the input and we just respond. That's our first inclination. So please, if any of this has shed some light on sensory processing for yourself, I want you, or for your child, I really want you to think about the way you've looked at sensory processing and try to shift your perspective and, get to know a little bit more about the truth about sensory processing. I'd like you to be empathetic and understanding and respectful of all children, all people. Winnie Dunn is a wonderful occupational therapist. She wrote a really great, short, quick little read of a book called Living Sensationally. And she says, understanding sensory processing is just one more way for us to understand each other as human beings. It's another way for us to appreciate our similarities and respect our differences. And I think that is just so well said and so very important. So I want to invite you to explore your sensory differences. Look at your sensory preferences and your sensory needs and compare those to your children's and see where you're the same and where you're different. And where you're different, that's where we need to work on strategies, because nothing is more frustrating than if you are over responsive to touch and your child wants to hug you and touch you and hold you and they need to stroke your hair so they can fall asleep, right? It's a mismatch. And we'll dive into that in another episode. So please remember what I've said in the past. Your child isn't broken. Your child doesn't need to be fixed. Sensory processing is a normal variation of human development, and it is absolutely something that you can learn more about and appreciate and change how you understand it and how you support it and how you help your child to thrive and succeed. So thank you so much for joining me today. And, if you like what you're hearing here, if you know other people that would benefit from the information that I'm sharing, please encourage others to join and listen to this podcast. Follow me on social media, sign up for my newsletter. Just stay in touch with me so you can learn about the things that are coming down the road. Comment, send me a message on social media or in response to this podcast. Let me know. You can email me at Debra@stepsfordevelopment.com. And let me know if you'd like more one-on-one support, you want to understand some aspect of sensory processing a little bit more deeply. I'd love to share with you what I can offer for coaching. Maybe that's right for you. Maybe you just want a little extra support, and I'm more than happy to help you see that you're not failing, you're trying, and you're doing a great job. So stay in touch, stick around for the next episode, and until next time, bye.